pretty close.
Now we shouldn't say where we live on record. So.
Yeah, I'm gonna be here for a month and a half, so I'm leaving end of August. I'll message you. Let's grab coffee.
Perfect. Yeah.
All right. Okay, we're ready to start. Good luck and enjoy the session.
Great.
Great. Thank you.
Is everything live now, or? Okay. All right. I assume so. So welcome.
Not yet. Not yet. Yes. Just 1 second, David. A video is going to be played. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the State and the Frontier Innovation session. Without any further ado, please welcome our chair, David Yang, to open this session. Mr. David Yang, the screen is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Welcome everyone to the session. We have today sort of three, I think, very sort of interesting talks along the topic of state and innovation. So we'll have Weijia, who's substituting in with Nathan Lane, who's actually sort of in some COVID situation right now in Oxford. So Weijia is going to tell us about information is power. And then Ernest next will tell us about innovation, network, policy, and growth. And I'll go last with state and data-intensive innovation. So I think given the format, we'll have roughly about 20 minutes per talk. So we can go for 15 minutes for the presentation and maybe 5 minutes in the end for Q&A. And I was told that the best way to get the Q&A into the session is to just type in your question in the Q&A, and I will moderate the questions, and then I'll feed the questions to the speaker in the end. Without further ado, Weijia, would you like to share your screen?
Yes, thank you, David. So this is joint work with Nathan Lin from Oxford. And I apologize in advance if I'm sometimes slow because it's 1 a.m. in Australia now. So I will try to be at my best capacity today. So this is a very much work in progress, but the project is motivated by the huge optimism in the democratic potential of information technology. So if you want to liberate a society, all you need is the internet. It's a very nice quote from an activist, actually a key activist of Arab Spring. But this techno optimism has faded quite a lot recently. So as reflected by the quote from the same activist 5 years later. So this is a very simple applied theory paper where we try to address this question, that is there any fundamental economic force in the economy that drives a bias in information technology? So specifically, we want to ask the question, does information technology empower the state to know much more about the citizens, but only allow the citizens to know a bit more about the state? And our argument is that this is a very realistic and worrisome possibility. We basically borrow everything from borrow the insights from the key literature on directed technical changes. We basically trace everything back to the rise of business concentration. And we show that with a lot of large firms around the economy, the incentive of R&D in information technology will indeed be quite biased. It would empower big firms to know as much as possible about their consumer base, but really doesn't help that much for the consumers to be knowledgeable about big firms. So such biased IT can be borrowed by any large organization to learn about individuals. And you can see the political spillover can be potentially quite serious because this would eventually give rise to a civilian state without much accountability. And we went on to characterize another result showing that such biased IT can consolidate dictatorship but undermine democracy in a very standard Asimov-Robinson democratization framework. Due to the time constraint today, I would only be able to talk basically about the first 1/3 of the argument, but I will talk a bit about the intuition for the rest of the logic chain. Again, I won't be able to have much time talking about the literature, but if you're interested, we can talk a bit more in the Q&A session. So today I'm just going to present the simplest possible, really a toy version of the model to basically illustrate the basic forces we want to formalize. So we're looking at an economy with a unit mass of what we call traditional sectors. So these are basic sectors that do not produce information technology products. So a fraction, an M fraction of the sectors are basically dominated by an incumbent monopoly firm. So M is an exogenous parameter, and this is of proxy of business concentration, very simple. The rest of the sectors populated by competitive firms, essentially. We also have a unit mass of consumers, and their utility depends on the quality of product from each sector, and also their idiosyncratic consumer taste. We introduce very simple information asymmetry, but it's a two-sided information asymmetry. The consumer knows everything about his own taste, but he doesn't know much about the product quality of the firms except the probability distribution. The firm knows everything about the quality of their own product, but they don't know much about consumer taste. So in this model, we allow consumers and producers to learn about each other through information technology. Specifically, there's a tech firm that develops what we call a producer information technology. So this producer information technology would enable the firms to know everything about the consumers with a probability S. So S is the first key endogenous variable that measures effectiveness of producer IT. We have another tech firm that develops what we call a consumer information technology. This IT would enable consumer to know everything about product quality with a probability T. So T is the second key endogenous variable that basically proxies the effectiveness of consumer IT. As you can see, it's a highly stylized model. Everything is kept at the simplest possible level. So how can we characterize the equivalent level of information technology effectiveness? We need to first understand the value of information for the producers and the consumers. So first, we want to know what is the additional profit? What is the extra profit a firm can basically capture by being very knowledgeable about its consumer base? For competitive firms, they don't really value that much about information because the competitive price already summarizes all the necessary information for the sector. So it's a classical insight of Hayek. So for competitive firms, they don't demand any producer information technology in our model. For the monopoly firms, however, information is potentially extremely valuable because the information, by being very knowledgeable about the consumer base, the incumbent monopoly would be able to deter entry from potential competitors and also extract all potential surplus from transaction with consumers. So only monopoly firms will earn extra surplus from information, and as a consequence, only monopoly firms value such information technology. This allows us to characterize the maximum price the tech firm can charge for its producer IT product. Basically, with probability S, the producer IT is effective, which consolidates the monopoly status of any incumbent firm which purchased such a product. So this would enable the monopoly firm to capture a lot of surplus. First, a fraction T of the consumers, they are very knowledgeable about product quality. And the monopoly firm captures pi1 profit from those informed consumers. The rest of the consumers, they are not knowledgeable about product quality, and the monopoly firm captured pi2 from those consumers. A very important result that basically drives the entire model is that the informed monopoly actually captures more profit from a consumer who is quite knowledgeable than from a consumer who is quite ignorant about product quality. So the basic reason is that for an informed monopoly, it actually hates any friction in the economy. And if the consumers are quite unaware of product quality, it actually generates a lot of friction in the economy. Based on the pricing strategy of the producer IT product, we can write down the profit maximization problem for the tech firm. Very simple. On the revenue side, only the firms that are operating in the potentially monopolistic sector will demand this producer IT product. And this is the price of the producer IT we have just derived here. And the unit, and the last term is basically the R&D cost. So this will give us a very simple characterization of the optimal producer IT effectiveness as a best reaction function to the consumer IT effectiveness. So we have this key result that producer IT will become more effective when consumer IT become more effective, because it enables the informed monopoly firm to capture more surplus. The other results are very straightforward. Producer IT will become more effective when the economy becomes more monopolistic, and when the R&D cost decreases. That's when mu becomes larger. So M and mu are basically the key exogenous parameter in the model. That's the first side of the story. We also need to derive the consumer IT as a best reaction function to producer IT. To do that, we need to know what is the value of information for consumers. For consumers, they are going to earn zero consumer surplus from any monopolistic sector. But for competitive sectors, which is of this fraction, they're going to earn a positive consumer surplus. And they're actually going to earn extra consumer surplus from knowing everything about product quality, so they can make very informed purchase decision. So this is a very ugly formula, but we can just show that it's positive. That's all what we need for us to proceed the analysis. So the consumer IT firm's problem is quite analogous. This is the maximum price you can charge from consumers, and this is the R&D cost. So consumer IT will actually become more effective when producer IT becomes less effective. And this is because a more effective producer IT actually depress the consumer's incentive to know much about product quality, because in a highly monopolistic economy, the consumer will always get zero consumer surplus anyway. They don't have much incentive to know about product quality. And the analogous argument applies to when the potential monopolistic sectors become more prevalent. And of course, when it becomes easier to do R&D, then consumer IT will become more effective. So with these two, so we now have the best reaction function for consumer IT. And when we put these two best reaction functions together, we would be able to get the equilibrium level of information technologies for both sectors. So we actually focus on the case when it's equally costly to do R&D for both consumer and producer IT. We find it's a very realistic assumption because they're basically using the same technology to do R&D, right? So they're using the same hardware hardware, very similar talent pool of software engineers, etc. But it's also very important for theory because it means that information technology itself is actually neutral on the cost side. So any bias we document is because of something else. So now we basically perform comparative statistics with respect to sufficient statistic, that is the ratio of effectiveness of producer IT with respect to the effectiveness of consumer IT. So this will basically tell us how biased information technology is that favors producers but is against consumers. So that ratio is basically the slope of this blue dashed line here that connects the equilibrium of the economy and also the 0.00. So here comes the first key comparative static result, which is quite intuitive. When an exogenous shock arrives that makes the economy more monopolistic, this would produce a strong bias that favors producers and is against consumers. So when the economy becomes more monopolistic, the demand for better producer IT will increase because there are more firms that really want to know about consumer base. This would intensify R&D effort in the producer IT sector, so S star will increase. But with a more monopolistic sector, monopolistic economy, the consumers will become more discouraged and they don't want to know that much about product quality anymore. So in that case, R&D effort for consumer IT will decrease. So the net effect on the ratio is, of course, the ratio will also increase. So here we actually have an absolute bias in the sense that when the equilibrium moves from here to here, it's not only that the ratio increases, it's actually the consumer IT will actually become less effective in an absolute manner, and producer IT will become more effective in an absolute manner. An even more interesting result is when an exogenous shock arrives that makes it cheaper to do R&D for both sectors. So we have assumed that they are using the same technology to do R&D in both information technology sectors. So even though it's equally cheaper to do R&D in both sectors, we're still going to see a bias that favors producers against consumers in IT R&D effort. Now, this is because apart from the direct effect of a cheaper R&D effort, there are actually indirect effects. So a naive analysis will only look at the direct effect and say that because it's cheaper to do R&D, both consumer and producer IT will become more effective in a strictly proportional manner. And so there will be no bias. But there are actually additional indirect effects. After the direct effect has been fully realized, a more effective producer IT actually partially depresses consumer IT. But we will not cancel the full direct effect. At the same time, more effective consumer IT will further incentivize investment in producer IT. So the net effect is that both producer and consumer IT will become more effective, but the incremental improvement of producer IT here will far outpace the incremental improvement in consumer IT. Okay, so that's why we have this bias result, and this is a relative bias. So we have this result because first, there's a very strong interdependence between these two technologies, which is not really the focus of the traditional literature on directed technical changes. And second, everything is still actually fundamentally driven by business concentration. So if the economy is fully competitive, we are not going to have such a relative bias result at all. It's because when the economy is fully competitive, no firm will ever demand much information about consumers. All the necessary information has been summarized in the price vector. So any improvement in information technology will only benefit the consumer, but not producer. So that's basically what I want to talk about today. It's actually only the first step in our story where we document in a very simple formal model how higher level of business concentration can cause really strong bias in information technology. In the second step, we basically shows how such biased information technology can produce really strong spillover in the political sphere. It would facilitate quite effective surveillance of citizens, but at the same time, it won't improve that much citizens' effort to hold the government accountable, simply because the technology that helps individuals to monitor large organizations does not improve at the same speed as those technologies that help large organizations to monitor individuals. And then we integrate everything in an Asimov-Robinson style model of democratization. And we show that such biased IT really help the dictatorship to precisely identify the real troublemakers. And as a consequence, they would be able to repress citizens in a far surgical and more effective manner. As a consequence, this kind of biased IT is really good at stabilizing the dictatorship. At the same time, because the dictatorship now can process social conflict with far more effective and surgical violence, biased IT also reduces advantage of democracy over dictatorship in the peaceful processing of social conflict. As a consequence, this would destabilize democracy because it reduces the appeal of democracy to economic elites who foresees that if they establish a dictatorship in the future, they would spend less resource in repression. So then the final step of the analysis, which is what we're working on now, is to take the model to data. So the first step in our analysis is trying to classify patterns into those two types of technology, which are conceptually distinct, but we need to find a good algorithm to actually classify patterns in an empirical manner. And the second, after we have done that step, what we really want to do is to basically perform a causal inference and trying to understand whether higher business concentration does produce quite different results on regime stability for different regimes with a mediator variable of biased information technology. So I'll stop here. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. This is super fascinating. We're a bit sort of short on time, so I don't see any questions coming through Q&A. So I encourage everyone to send questions in, and then we can go straight to Ernest talks, and then if there are more questions about this, and then we can save the Q&A together after Ernest talk.
Cool.
Great. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks, David, for putting this program together. So I will present this recent work that's joined with Wei Chen and Michael Song on decentralized industrial policy. Okay. So what are industrial policies? Well, these are the selective government intervention into key sectors of the economy, designate strategic sectors to promote them. These policies are especially pervasive in East Asia, but also is making a comeback in the developed world as well. And it's super pervasive in China, where we see governments enacting 5-year plans, setting up special economic zones, fund state-owned firms and give them subsidies, tax incentives, prioritize land access, and so on. So how to conduct industrial policy? Well, in an earlier paper, I study industrial policy in a closed economy. And basically, I showed that when there are market imperfections in the economy, and when industries form input-output linkages by buying inputs from each other, the distortionary effects of these imperfections, such as quota constraints, contracting friction, market power, they compound in a way that upstream sector of the economy become inefficiently too small, and the well-meaning government should subsidize upstream sector to promote welfare of the consumer. Now, China, like many other countries in the world, it's a multi-region economy where policies are often enacted by local governments. And the fact that local governments may only care about the well-being or the economic performance of the local economy as opposed to the nation as a whole create a potential misalignment in incentive between local governments and central government, and especially in the presence of cross-region trade and input-output linkages. So the goal of this paper is to first provide a theory of industrial policy in multi-region production networks. When multiple regions trade with each other, we're going to think carefully about local versus central incentives in picking out strategic industries in such a setting. And we're going to provide some evidence from China. So to motivate what we are going to do, let's consider a very simple example economy with two regions, left and right. And in each of these economies, there are three sectors. So upstream produces metal. You need metal to produce concrete. You need concrete to produce houses, which consumer directly consumes. First, suppose the two regions do not trade with each other. So it's like two separate independent economies. And the point of this previous paper is that local government would like to subsidize the upstream sector because distortionary effects along intermediate linkages actually compound. Now, central government would like to subsidize upstream sector as well in this setting. Okay, the fact that the two regions don't trade means local and central incentives are aligned. Now imagine that the two regions actually trade, and imagine a particular configuration where to produce concrete, you actually need the variety of metal produced from the other region. So they basically trade metal and use metal to produce concrete. In that world, from a central planner's perspective, the incentive is exactly the same. Subsidize metal production in both regions, benefit consumers in both regions. Whereas from local planners' perspective, if we subsidize metal, all the benefits, the additional metal produced, all the benefit will accrue to consumers in the other region. So local government may no longer have the incentive to subsidize metal. That basically highlights the intuition behind this distinction in local versus central incentives. And that's the point of this study. So given that it's a very short talk, I will not actually go through the model at all. And I will directly tell you the punchline from the model and how we take it to data. But just an overview, we're considering a trade model, multi-region trade with input-output linkages. So to produce car in one region, the manufacturer may need to buy tire from another region, an engine from a third region, and so on. So it's basically the calendar-parallel model of trade. And we're going to introduce market imperfections of the sort in the previous paper, like think of it as financial frictions or contracting frictions. We're going to derive formulas or sufficient statistics that capture the first order effects of industrial policy. And in particular, we will have two sufficient statistics that vary at the region by industry level. We're going to call these the local and central intervention indices. These indices have the following properties. So the local index, for example, it captures for the local index for each region industry captures the local welfare impact per unit subsidy given to that region industry, financed by taxing local agents in that region. And the central index captures the national welfare gain using a particular formulation of social welfare function per unit of subsidy financed by taxing nationally. So what these objects capture is that the local index captures the incentive of a well-meaning local government, a local planner, to subsidize local industries if the local planner care about local welfare. The central index captures the incentive of a central government. And these sufficient statistics, they are bend for the buck type of measures. So if the measure is positive, that means subsidy actually raised the welfare, respectively for local and central. Now, intuitively, the central index tends to be high in upstream sectors, meaning central planner would like to subsidize upstream sectors. And the local index instead tends to be high in sectors that are upstream only to local production. So in the previous example, if my region produces metal, but most of the output goes to other region, metal wouldn't be considered upstream to local production. So local planners would like to subsidize sectors that are upstream to local production, and on the other hand, tax sectors that supply to other regions or export a lot. And by export, we mean exporting to other regions. These sufficient statistics average to 0, which means random subsidies or uniform subsidies to all sectors are ineffective. And they're only effective if planner actually targets sectors that have high indices and tax sectors that have low indices, and they can be used for welfare evaluation. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to talk about empirical evidence. We're going to have two kinds of evidence and one application. The first kind, we're going to look at policy platforms associated with different levels of government in China. We're going to look at central versus provincial policy platforms. So we're going to compare central or provincially affiliated state-owned firms, central versus provincial 5-year plans and special economic zones. What we're going to show is the central index predicts central policy platform. So an industry with high central index, such as iron, steel, heavy chemicals, they predict state-owned firm, 5-year plans, special economic zones. The industry is designated in these interventions affiliated with central government. On the other hand, the local intervention index actually differ quite substantially from the central index, and the local index predicts provincial policy platforms, okay? Number two, we're gonna look across policy platforms at the province level, but across provinces. We're gonna show that in provinces with greater fiscal autonomy, policies seem to be more aligned with the local index. So in the more developed regions of China, local industrial policy benefit domestic economy at the expense of other provinces. In less developed regions of China, local industrial policy actually may benefit other regions at the expense of own region. So at the end, we're going to be able to leverage these sufficient statistics to evaluate these local and spillover effects of local subsidies and perform some policy counterfactuals. Okay, so how do we construct these measures? First, we're going to start with region by industry input output table. So it is a perhaps 1200 by 1200 matrix, every region industry, okay, 1300 by 1300 matrix. And to construct these sufficient statistics, we need a measure of market imperfections. We need to know where are the financial frictions and so on. We're going to use a baseline level to construct our empirical results, which is firm level implicit wedges estimated from production data. But turns out that these intervention indices the variations are mostly driven by the network and trade structure, rather than how these imperfections are specified. So it turns out that these indices, or the qualitative feature of what I'm going to show you, is insensitive to how we measure these distortions. So the central intervention index correlates very strongly with upstreamness, no matter how you measure distortions. Local index only correlates very weakly with the central index, with correlation of about 0.4. Okay, so the local index, what are the intuitions? Well, one can write the index additively as a sum between two terms. One term that is for correcting market imperfections in a local production network. That captures the notion in which local planner would like to subsidize sectors that are upstream to local production. There's a second term that captures terms of trade manipulation. So if my region exports cars to other regions, I would like to exploit my monopoly power by taxing car production and manipulate relative prices across regions. This incentive is very similar to international trade, the incentive to impose tariffs, except here within a country, with a one country context, we're studying policy instrument via production taxes or subsidies rather than tariffs. Okay, so what we show is the central index tend to be high in upstream sectors, local index tend to be high in sectors that upstream to local production that at the exports very little. So for instance, the fraction of a sector's output sold as inputs to other regions positively predicts central index, negatively predicts local index. So think about iron or steel. These are highly tradable goods, even though they're very upstream. In contrast with concrete, which is an intermediate input that has very low tradability. So a central planner, our model would predict that central planner would like to subsidize iron and steel production, doesn't have very strong incentive to subsidize concrete. For a local planner, because concrete is an intermediate input, local planner have strong incentive to subsidize concrete, and local planners' incentive to target steel industry depend on whether domestically we produce steel for domestic use or whether we produce steel to be shipped to other regions. So for instance, Beijing, 80% of Beijing's metal output is sold to other regions. So local planner in Beijing has incentive to tax metal production in Beijing. In contrast, Shanghai doesn't have incentive to tax metal production because most of the metal produced in Shanghai is used domestically. And for concrete, for instance, central planner has little incentive to tax or subsidize concrete production. Local planner would like to subsidize concrete production just because concrete is used as intermediate inputs domestically, doesn't export away. So we're then going to look at various policy platforms. The bottom line is, if we look at, for instance, the share of capital that's owned by state-owned firms affiliated by central government or local government, well, central state-owned firms tend to be predicted by cross-sector variation in the central index. Local state-owned firms tend to be present in sectors with greater local index. And if we compare across provinces, the correlation between local state-owned firm presence and local index, a high correlation means local state-owned firms are better targeted at sectors that should be subsidized for domestic welfare. This index is positively correlated with fiscal autonomy in the region. So if a region is more developed, less reliant on fiscal transfer from the central government, they have greater autonomy in designing their own local industrial policy. And in these regions, local industrial policy align better with the local index as opposed to central, okay? We also look at 5-year plans and special economic zones, basically same picture. Central 5-year plan and special economic zones align with central index, provincial level align with the local index. Now, if we look at firm-specific wedges using sort of share and clean out type to back out reduced form wedges as a measure of implicit subsidy, we use the tax survey data, and we basically find that firms in sectors with greater local index, these local state-owned firms seem to have implicit subsidies in capital, labor, and land in all factors of production. And through a map, the warmer colors indicate provinces whose local industrial policy generate positive spillover to the rest of China. So these less developed regions, their local industrial policy generate positive spillover to all the coastal, more developed region. By contrast, the more developed region of China, their local industrial policy benefit themselves, but at the expense of the inner and less developed region. That's a big contrast that's fairly robust to how we measure these objects. And the last piece, we can use the sufficient statistics to do welfare evaluation and to do policy counterfactual, because these are bang for the buck measures. If we know how much government spend in terms of subsidies, we can come up with precise welfare numbers. But just in terms of bang for the buck, local subsidy have about 5% bang for the buck in the eastern or more developed regions, have lower bang for the buck in the less developed region. And central subsidy on national welfare bang for the buck is a bit higher. And we evaluate, what if local governments redirect their subsidy to sectors that are more aligned with a central incentive, or maybe more realigned to simpler measures, such as shares of output sold as intermediate inputs. We find substantial welfare gain if local governments can coordinate, or maybe coordinated by at the instruction of central government, to target simple measures such as the fraction of output sold to other producers. And let me conclude here. We build a positive theory of industrial policy in multi-region production networks and use China as an application. The theory we derive allow us to come up with 2 sufficient statistics that vary at the region by industry level to capture central and local incentive to conduct industrial policy. And these sufficient statistics are suitable for quantitative evaluation and counterfactuals. We show that local planners have the incentive to subsidize industries that are upstream to local production, but export very little. And in China, provincial level, local index seem to predict provincial level policy platforms. Central index predicts central policy platforms. Across regions, provinces with greater fiscal autonomy do better local targeting, but national welfare gain could be much higher if provinces coordinate with each other. Okay, that's what I have. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Ernest. So we have a question from Danny about whether the main assumption that's maintained in the model is that central and local government actually know the distortion parameters. And then I guess I'll follow up with a very related question of, I guess you put a lot of emphasis on misaligned incentives in driving the wedge between center and local government's policy. What about sort of asymmetric information? Is there a way to think about the role of that in also driving the differences?
Yeah. So we actually do not study this very formally in the paper, but one reason for delegation of local policy making is that local governments may be better informed about where the distortions are. It turns out that to come up with the set of sectors that, or the cross-sector ranking of which sector is a better target than others, it doesn't really matter what the distribution of distortions are, just because the trade network and the input-output table are so strong. If the machinery sector purchase very strongly iron and steel and do not purchase textile as an intermediate inputs, it's very hard for the degree of distortion to change the fact that central planner would like to subsidize iron and steel instead of textile. You need distortions, you need variation in distortions to be an order of magnitude larger than what's reasonable in order to drive away the qualitative features, even if distortions are not perfectly known. So practically, I think even if local planner or local governments have better knowledge about network structure or about where the distortions are, their policy prescription, if they were to maximize national welfare, wouldn't be very different from the prescription of a central planner. So that's the sense in which I think the qualitative feature of the empirical findings are very robust, although we do not study that information problem and the delegation trade-offs in the paper. Thanks very much for the questions.
Great, thanks. I guess given the time, I will move on with my talk. And again, please, everyone, feel free to just type in the Q&A. And I think both Ernest and Wija are still here to answer the questions. Great, so I will share my screen. Okay, so this paper, I would like to sort of talk a little bit about sort of data-intensive innovation and the role of the state, and I'm going to use AI firms in China as an empirical setting to study this. And as hopefully sort of towards the end, I'll discuss the implication of this and actually sort of tie some of the two earlier papers, the themes mentioned in the earlier two papers together. Okay. So we'll start by thinking about sort of AI innovation, which has generated a lot of attention across social science. We typically consider AI innovation is data intensive. And by that, we mean that developing this technology requires a lot of data. Facial recognition, speech recognition, mass reading chess, these are sort of pipeline AI innovations or sort of automated vehicles and so on. These are oftentimes innovation that's not coming from big leap in algorithms, but rather it's the newly collected mass amount of data in recent decades that really generated the leap in the technology. The economic literature has so far focused quite a lot on the data collected by the private firms and the role such data plays in shaping AI innovation. And rightly so, sort of, you think the data collected by Google, collected by Facebook plays a very important role here. However, sort of if we delve back a little bit and think a bit sort of, in history and certainly up until today, states and governments within the state structure has been playing a very important role in collecting massive amount of data. And that's a lot of times just by simply state it's in this role of fulfilling its functions. And this can range from several sort of dimensions, such as states collecting massive amount of health administrative records for various medical diagnoses, and this become increasingly so during the COVID era. States are oftentimes in charge of collecting geospatial data, and this data can be very useful to detect, sort of, for example, mineral resources and so on. Satellite data, radar data are also sort of oftentimes sort of collected and even monopolized by the states, and again, you can see the implications of such data might be useful for AI applications. And a bit closer to the examples I'm going to talk through today, the video data coming from public civilian system that's collected oftentimes exclusively by the state, and this can be a key input into facial recognition technology. So these data that have been collected by the states are oftentimes directly or indirectly accessible by the private firms, and to the extent that such data can help sort of improving the algorithms of the AI technology, that can generate an important role in which state data, government data can play in shaping the data-intensive technology as a whole. Okay, so what we want to do in this paper is to ask the question: how does government data shapes data-intensive innovation? I'm going to highlight a particular mechanism through which such influence can happen. That is, data, and to some extent, the trained algorithms coming from the data can be shared across multiple purposes within the firm. And this will imply that economies of scope of government data could arise. So take a concrete example of an AI firm who's providing certain services to the government to, for example, process the government data. And by definition, that government data would then be accessible by the AI firm. And given to the extent that such data can be shared across multiple purposes, the AI firm could use the data to produce services and technology for the government, but it can also use the exact same data to produce and innovate for a much larger market in the commercial sector, and that will potentially have implications for the industry and for the innovation frontier as a whole. Okay, so we're going to take this particular mechanism and this intuition, and we're going to try to document the existence of economic scope of government data in the context of a leading AI sector that's in a country that's at the technological frontier, which is the facial recognition AI sector in China. I'm going to show you sort of, and hopefully convince you that sort of after the AI firms in China received a government contract that allows them to access larger amount of government data, and then we can sort of measure and proxy for the quantity of government data in various ways. Those AI firms not only produce more software and innovate more software in terms of the software for the government sector, but also simultaneously for the commercial sector. And that's directly sort of implies the presence of economy of scope, and again sort of show, hopefully demonstrate that the role of government data can be playing in the AI innovation, more generally speaking, rather than just the state-related sectors. Okay, so given the time to talk, I want to just focus on the empirical part of this paper. There's a couple of empirical challenges to document sort of essentially the result I just summarized. We would essentially need 3 different sources of data sets to be able to piece together that result. So we need to have a data set that linked AI firms to government contracts and the way they're interacting with the government and so on. We'll need a data set that essentially sort of describe the software innovation that the AI firms are producing. And in particular, not only the total number of software, but also the software that they're producing for the government and also for the commercial sector. So we'll need to be able to categorize the software production. And finally, and this is going to be a generic challenge for the studies on data sector in general, which is that we very rarely have direct measurement of the quantity of data the firms have access to or government collect. So we need to find various ways to proxy the amount of data that the firms receive access to. Okay, and on top of that, there are, we hopefully are able to solve also some of the more standard identification challenges. The firms receiving a government contract is not going to be random, both the timing potentially and also the type of firms who receive that. So we're going to be dealing with the non-random assignment of the government contracts. And contracts, of course, come with many things beyond just the data itself. It comes with capital, it comes with potential connections to the government. So hopefully our empirical strategy can also sort of deal with those. Okay, so let me very quickly describe the data sets that we use for this project. And we sort of built the 3 data sets that I just outlined from scratch for this project. So we combined sort of a roster of the AI firms, facial recognition AI firms that's operating in China. That's about 1,000 of such firms. We then sort of match these firms with a data set that describe the universe of the government procurement contracts that's ever issued by the Chinese government over the last 10 years. That's about 3 million such contracts. And then combining the 2 data sets that will allow us to know which AI firms at what time are providing services to a local sort of government unit. In particular, we're going to focus on the local police department of the Chinese government, which use the facial recognition for public security purposes and so on. Okay, and then for the primary outcome of interest, we're going to look at the firm's software production. In the context of China, all the software firms would need to register the software with China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. So that makes our life a little bit easier, especially given the vast majority of these firms are not public firms. So we don't know directly what's the kind of output they have. Okay, and as I mentioned before, it's very important for us to not only know the full account of software production, but to know the sort of the specific market or customer that the software production is meant for. So we wanted to be able to categorize whether the software is for the government. So take example here coming from a real software that's called Smart City Real-Time Monitoring System on my traffic route. We're going to categorize such software as a software intended for the government. And if a software has labels such as visual recognition system for smart retail, we're going to categorize software, these kind of software to be software for the commercial market. The government don't have a direct interest in. Okay, and we also have a residual category that the ones that are probably more general for either markets, and we're going to put that into that bucket. Okay. I won't have time to go into the details here, but we're not able to categorize all these by hand given the volume of it. So we use the machine learning technology to be able to categorize, and our accuracy rate of this categorization exercise is very high. Okay. A final sort of empirical data set that we need to be assembled is one that allows us to measure the amount of data that the firm have access to. So we use several strategies, but the primary ones that we'd like to focus on here is that we take the intuition that for when a facial recognition AI firm work with a local police department, the amount of data that the facial recognition AI firm would have access to is going to be very much related to the amount of civilian systems, sort of the camera density in a particular sort of local government's jurisdiction has. Okay, so the more cameras in a particular city, for example, the more video streams that's going to be collected out of those cameras, and the more data and faces that AI firms will be able to have access to train these algorithms. So to measure the amount of cameras, we're going to go back to the procurement contracts and to take out all the procurement contracts that the local police department has signed with a hardware firm that sell cameras, AI-equipped high-resolution cameras. And then we're going to count sort of the amount of cameras that's being purchased by each local police department over the last 10 years. And this allows us to have a time-varying camera density sort of measurements over time. This is going to be our proxy for the amount of whether a particular public security contract is richer in data or scarce in data. Okay, so we're going to, for the baseline, we're going to divide those contracts by above medium camera density contracts coming from a local police department. That's going to be relatively richer in data, and the below medium is going to be relatively scarcer in data. Okay, so with these three data sets, what this allows us to do is to implement the triple diff strategy, which essentially we're going to compare the cumulative software releases of a particular AI firm before and after that particular firm received its first data-rich public security contract relative to the firm's first public security contract is a data scarce one. Okay, so the three layers of the triple diff that we're exporting here is that we're always going to include firm fixed effects, which means we're going to compare sort of differences within the firm just before and just after. So this is going to be in the unit of sum a year, just before and just after the firm received its first contract. We're going to always include the calendar time fixed effect. So we're going to exploiting different firms' first contract with a local police department arrives at different time in terms of calendar time. And then the third difference that we're exploiting is that if it's the difference between whether the first contract is a data-rich one, again, with a local police department that has above medium camera density, surveillance camera density network versus a data-scarce one, which is with a local police department that has below medium camera density network. Okay, so the third diff is important because it sort of take out sort of any generic things that might come with a government contract, such as sort of connection, indication of connection with the local government, potentially some inflow of capital, and any other sort of fixed characteristics might come with working with the local public security units of the Chinese government. And we're only looking at the wedges between the data-rich contracts versus the data-scarce contract. Okay, so our baseline results can be summarized in essentially a few figures. What I want to show you first is as outcome is the amount of software that the firms are producing for the government users. So I'm showing you first the graph, which is sort of the firm's software producing after they receive its first contract, that public security contract that is data scarce. What you see here is that there's no pre-trend leading up to the contract arrival, which is indicated by the vertical line, but there's a sharp increase in the software production for the government after the receipt of the data scarce contract. You see similar patterns for the receipt of a data-rich contract for the particular firm. But if you notice here that the data-rich contracts increase is steeper for the data-scarce one. So if we do the triple dip, which I show you, which I show in the final graph here, the triple dip coefficient is also positive, which means that the data-rich contract generate yet a differentially bigger effect on government software production compared to the data-scarce one. Now, this could be partially mechanical because these firms are working for the local governments to begin with, and they're probably going to produce something for the local governments. So it's sort of a real test for the potential crowding in and the indication of economy of scope is to look at what the firms do for the commercial market. And here in the bottom panel here, I'm showing you, we see very similar effects as the government software production. That is, when the firm receives its first data scarce government contract, it starts to produce more for the commercial market, and this again happens almost immediately. And they start to produce more for the commercial market, and differentially so when it received its first data-rich contract. Again, the triple diff coefficient is positive and increasingly so over the course of the first 3 years of the contract received. What this again implies is that net of the potential crowding out of I just get a government contract, I might want to reallocate my resources to produce for the government, this actually generates an almost immediate and simultaneous crowding in the commercial market, that the firms are producing more for the commercial market, that would take as a very strong evidence for economic scope of the data, that the same data the firm had access to is now being productive in innovating for the commercial sector. The government don't have a direct interest in. Okay. So for the final minute I have, what I want to show you is that another indication for data playing a very important role here is that we can use our same baseline specification, but instead of looking at AI software, we look at sort of whether the firms are producing data complementary intermediary outputs such as data management tools, data sort of storage tools, and so on. And we see that those AI firms who received a data-rich government contract start producing more for in the category of data complementary software. That's suggesting sort of they're now being handled a sort of the amount of data that they haven't been able to handle before, and then have to develop these management softwares. Okay, so let me conclude given the time. What this shows is that the state can play an important role in shaping the direction and rate of data-intensive sector, particularly because the state has been the key collector of a lot of data that don't have commercial substitutes, private substitutes. And to the extent that data has economy of scope and can be shared across multiple purposes, this can generate a fairly large impact. Now, this sort of ability related to the talks that we just saw, which is that you can consider the state's collection of data and sharing the data to the firm as an indirect or unintended even industrial policy, because in this particular case, the Chinese government is not sharing the data for the purpose of for spurring innovation, purely for the purpose of public security. But in that process, the firm who receive the access to those data are not be able to innovate and generate more products for the commercial market that firms don't have direct interest in. All right, I should end here given the time. We might not have time for additional questions, but just in case there are some questions coming from the Q&A, both for me and for Ernest and for Weijia, I think this might be the last chance if someone have additional questions. Otherwise, thank you all for tuning in and for this session. Hope you are all well, and I think we're going to stay on this Zoom for a bit longer in case people have questions. But otherwise, thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, David, for organizing this.
Thanks
hopefully we can all be in Bali for this.
Yeah, I hope so too. And given that it's actually very convenient for me to travel to Bali, especially. Yeah. I will take leave now. Thank you so much. Hope I can see you soon in other events.
Yeah.
Yeah. See you, David. See you, Ernest.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right.
See you.
I'm gonna go off too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.